The first rays of dawn painted the London sky in shades of pink and gold as the city stirred to life on what would become one of the most memorable days in modern British history. Prince William stood at the tall windows of his private chambers in Kensington Palace, watching the early morning joggers and dog walkers in Hyde Park below. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, and for a moment he barely recognized the man looking back. Today was different from any other day in his 39 years of life. Today his father would become king, and everything about their family's future would change forever. Catherine emerged from their dressing room, her silk robe flowing behind her as she moved with the quiet grace that had made her beloved by the British people. She could see the tension in her husband's shoulders even from across the room. After more than a decade of marriage, she had learned to read his moods like weather patterns, and this morning she sensed the storm of emotions brewing beneath his calm exterior. She placed her hand gently on his arm, feeling the tight muscles relax slightly under her touch. The children were already awake in their rooms down the hall. Princess Charlotte had been up since 5 in the morning, too excited to sleep any longer. She had tried on her ceremonial dress 3 times already, each time asking her nanny if she looked proper enough for such an important day. Her older brother George moved through his morning routine with the careful precision of a boy who understood that today would be different from any other day in his young life. At 8 years old, he had begun to grasp the weight of his position as future heir to the throne, though he still occasionally forgot and acted like any normal child his age. Young Prince Louis presented the biggest challenge for his parents on this historic morning. At only 4 years old, he had no real understanding of why everyone seemed so serious and why he had to wear uncomfortable formal clothes instead of his favorite dinosaur pajamas. Catherine had spent extra time with him the night before, explaining, in simple terms, that today was a very special day for Grandpapa Charles, and that they would all need to be on their very best behavior. Louis had nodded solemnly at the time, but this morning he was already showing signs of the restless energy that made him both adorable and unpredictable during public appearances. The breakfast table in their private dining room felt unusually quiet despite the presence of all 5 family members. Usually their morning meals were filled with chatter about school activities, weekend plans, and the children's various interests. Today, however, everyone seemed lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. William tried to maintain a sense of normalcy by asking George about his upcoming football match and complimenting Charlotte on how grown-up she looked in her special dress. But even the children could sense that this was no ordinary morning. Staff. Members moved through the palace with heightened efficiency, their usual friendly chatter replaced by focused professionalism. Everyone understood that today's events would be watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world, and there was no room for even the smallest mistake. Catherine's personal dresser had arrived early to help with final adjustments to her outfit, while William's valet ensured every detail of his ceremonial uniform was perfect. The children's nanny worked with quiet determination to make sure George, Charlotte, and Louis looked impeccable without feeling uncomfortable in their formal attire. As the morning progressed, the sounds of London preparing for the coronation began to drift through the palace windows. They could hear the distant rumble of barriers being set up along the procession route, the testing of sound systems, and the growing murmur of crowds gathering despite the early hour. Television crews from around the world had been setting up their equipment since before dawn, and the distinctive hum of news helicopters circling overhead added to the sense of momentous occasion. Catherine took a few quiet moments to call her parents, Michael and Carol Middleton, who would be attending the ceremony as honored guests. Her mother's voice carried a mixture of pride and nervousness that perfectly matched Catherine's own feelings. They had come so far from the days when Catherine was simply a university student who happened to catch the eye of the second in line to the throne. Now she was preparing to support her husband through one of the most significant transitions in modern royal history. The security briefings had been thorough and somewhat overwhelming. Royal protection officers had gone over every detail of the day's schedule multiple times, ensuring that William and Catherine understood exactly where they needed to be at every moment. The children had been given their own simplified version of the timeline, with special attention paid to the moments when they would need to sit very still and the times when they would be allowed to relax slightly. William found himself thinking about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had passed away just months earlier. Her absence felt particularly acute on this morning, when the family needed her steady presence and decades of experience more than ever. She had always been the anchor that kept the royal family grounded during times of change and uncertainty. Now that responsibility would fall to his father, and eventually to William himself. The wardrobe selections had been planned months in advance, with careful consideration given to every detail from the color choices to the symbolic meaning of various accessories. Catherine's outfit had been designed to honor both tradition and her own personal style, while the children's clothing struck a balance between formality appropriate for the occasion and comfort necessary for young people who would be sitting through a lengthy ceremony. As the departure time approached, the family gathered in the main hallway of their private apartments. The children lined up for final inspections, with George standing tall and serious, Charlotte practically glowing with excitement, and Louis doing his best to stand still despite his obvious desire to run around and explore. William and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their shared hopes and concerns for the day ahead. The morning sun had risen higher now, streaming through the palace windows and casting everything in a warm, golden light that seemed almost magical. Outside, they could hear the growing crowds and the increasing activity as London prepared to witness history. In just a few hours, they would be part of one of the most ancient and sacred ceremonies in British culture, and their lives would be forever changed by the events of this single extraordinary day. The royal convoy began its journey from Kensington Palace as church bells across London started their ceremonial chiming. Prince William sat beside Catherine in their state car, watching the familiar streets of their city transform into something almost magical. Thousands of people lined every road, many having camped overnight to secure the best viewing spots. Union Jack flags fluttered from every lamppost, and colorful bunting stretched between buildings like rainbow bridges celebrating this historic day. Catherine held her small purse with steady hands, though William could see the slight tension in her posture. She had attended many royal ceremonies over the years, but nothing compared to the magnitude of a coronation. The weight of history seemed to press against the windows of their car as they passed landmarks that had witnessed similar processions for nearly 1,000 years. She thought about all the future queens who had traveled these same routes, feeling both honored and slightly overwhelmed by joining their ranks in the pages of history. The children rode in a separate car just behind them, and William found himself turning around frequently to check on them through the rear window. Prince George sat with remarkable composure for an 8-year-old, his hands folded neatly in his lap as he watched the crowds with wide, curious eyes. He waved occasionally when people called his name, already understanding that this was part of his duty as a member of the royal family. His serious expression reminded both parents of William at that age, carrying responsibilities that other children could barely imagine. Princess Charlotte seemed to glow with excitement as she took in every detail of the spectacle around them. She pointed out interesting signs in the crowd to her younger brother, and waved enthusiastically at the children who had been lifted onto their parents' shoulders to get a better view. Her natural charm and confidence shone through even in this formal setting, and the crowds responded to her warmth with cheers and waves of their own. She had inherited her mother's ability to connect with people, even from a distance. Young Prince. Louis proved to be the wild card that everyone had expected. Despite all the careful preparation and gentle warnings about proper behavior, he was still very much a 4-year-old boy dealing with an overwhelming experience. He pressed his face against the car window, making funny faces at the crowds and occasionally bouncing in his seat with excitement. His nanny sat beside him, gently reminding him to sit properly while also understanding that expecting perfect behavior from such a young child during such a long day was perhaps unrealistic. The route to Westminster Abbey took them past some of London's most famous landmarks. As they passed Buckingham Palace, William pointed out to Catherine the massive crowds gathered around the Victoria Memorial. The golden figures atop the monument seemed to gleam extra brightly in the morning sun, as if they too were celebrating this momentous occasion. Street vendors moved through the crowd selling commemorative items, their cheerful calls adding to the festival atmosphere that had transformed the usually bustling city into something resembling a giant street party. Police officers on horseback rode alongside the convoy, their mounts stepping high and proud as if they understood the importance of their role in this historic procession. The crowds cheered not just for the royal family, but for everyone involved in making the day possible. From the mounted police to the military personnel who lined the route in their dress uniforms, the entire city seemed to be participating in this celebration of continuity and tradition. Catherine caught glimpses of people in the crowd holding homemade signs welcoming the new king and expressing their good wishes for the royal family. Many signs specifically mentioned William and Catherine, showing the genuine affection the British people felt for the couple who had brought a fresh, modern energy to the ancient institution of monarchy. Some people held up photographs of Queen Elizabeth II, honoring her memory on this day when her son would finally take the throne she had held for over 70 years. The security presence was massive, but carefully orchestrated to avoid creating an atmosphere of fear or tension. Plainclothes. Officers mingled with the crowds while uniformed personnel maintained a respectful but vigilant watch over the proceedings. William knew that thousands of people were working behind the scenes to ensure this day went smoothly. From the security forces, to the media coordinators, to the ceremonial experts who had planned every detail of the ancient rituals they were about to witness. As they approached Westminster Abbey, the crowds grew even thicker and more enthusiastic. The ancient church rose before them like a stone guardian of British history, its towers reaching toward the cloudy London sky. Hundreds of world leaders and dignitaries were already inside, having arrived earlier through less public entrances. The congregation would include presidents, prime ministers, and royalty from dozens of countries, all gathered to witness this transfer of power that represented one of the oldest continuing monarchies in the world. The car slowed as they reached the final approach to the Abbey. Catherine took a deep breath and straightened her already perfect posture, knowing that from this moment forward, every gesture and expression would be captured by cameras and analyzed by commentators around the world. She thought briefly of her parents who would be watching from inside the Abbey, and drew strength from knowing they were there to support her family during this pivotal moment. William felt his heartbeat quicken as the reality of the situation fully hit him. In just a few hours, his father would be crowned king, and William's own position in line to the throne would take on new meaning and urgency. The abstract concept of someday becoming king had suddenly become much more concrete and immediate. He reached over and squeezed Catherine's hand, grateful for her steady presence beside him as they prepared to step out of the car and into the full glare of worldwide attention. The children's car pulled up behind them, and William could see through the window that all three were now sitting up straight and looking appropriately serious for their public appearance. Even young Louis seemed to understand that something very important was about to happen. Their nanny gave them final encouraging words and smoothed down any wayward hair or wrinkled clothing, preparing them for what would likely be the most photographed walk of their young lives. The sounds of the crowd grew louder as the car doors prepared to open. Thousands of voices merged into a wall of sound that seemed to echo off the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey. Camera shutters clicked like mechanical rain, and the bright flashes of professional photography equipment created an almost strobe-like effect. The moment had arrived for the Wales family to step out of their private world and into the full ceremony of this historic coronation day. The heavy wooden doors of Westminster Abbey swung open as Prince William and his family stepped into the sacred space that had witnessed coronations for nearly 1,000 years. The ancient stone walls seemed to hold their breath as the Wales family made their entrance, their footsteps echoing softly on the worn flagstones that had been walked upon by kings and queens throughout British history. The Abbey felt alive with anticipation, every seat filled with dignitaries from around the world who had traveled great distances to witness this momentous occasion. Catherine moved with elegant grace down the aisle, her hand resting lightly on William's arm as they processed toward their designated seats in the front section, reserved for the immediate royal family. The children followed close behind, their small figures dwarfed by the massive Gothic architecture that soared above them. Princess Charlotte kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, remembering her mother's gentle instructions about proper posture and deportment during such formal occasions. Her natural poise seemed to shine even brighter in this setting, as if she instinctively understood the historical significance of where she stood. Prince George walked with careful, measured steps that showed his growing understanding of royal protocol. At 8 years old, he had already attended several important ceremonies, but nothing had prepared him for the grandeur and solemnity of Westminster Abbey, filled to capacity with world leaders and members of European royal families. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, and though it might have overwhelmed another child his age, George seemed to draw strength from the responsibility rather than shrink from it. Young Prince Louis presented the greatest challenge for his parents and caregivers during this crucial moment. The 4-year-old had been remarkably well behaved during the car journey, but the overwhelming sensory experience of the Abbey threatened to test his patience and attention span. The massive organ pipes towered above him like golden giants, and the hundreds of flickering candles created dancing shadows that caught his curious attention. His nanny stayed close beside him, ready to offer gentle guidance if his natural 4-year-old energy began to overwhelm his formal training. The congregation rose as one when King Charles entered the Abbey in his ceremonial robes, the ancient fabric catching the light from the stained glass windows that told stories of saints and monarchs from centuries past. William felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched his father process down the aisle with dignity and grace, carrying himself with the bearing of a man who had spent decades preparing for this single moment. The weight of 70 years of waiting seemed to lift from Charles's shoulders as he approached the coronation chair that had been used for English coronations since the 14th century. Catherine watched the ceremony unfold with a mixture of personal emotion and professional observation. As the future queen consort, she understood that every detail of this ancient ritual would someday apply to her own husband's coronation. She studied the movements of the clergy, the positioning of the ceremonial objects, and the precise timing of each element in the service. Her mind catalogued information that would prove invaluable when their own time came to participate in this sacred tradition, as the central figures rather than honored witnesses. The Archbishop of Canterbury's voice filled the vast space as he began the solemn words that had been spoken at coronations for generations. Each phrase carried the weight of history and tradition, connecting this modern ceremony to an unbroken chain of British monarchs stretching back through the centuries. William found himself thinking about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had sat in this same chair nearly 70 years earlier, as a young woman accepting the burden and privilege of the crown. Princess Charlotte watched with fascination as the various ceremonial objects were presented to her grandfather. The ancient crown jewels gleamed under the Abbey's lights, their precious stones reflecting rainbow colors onto the stone walls around them. She had seen these treasures before during private family visits to the Tower of London, but seeing them, used in their proper ceremonial context, gave them an entirely different meaning and power. The young princess seemed to understand instinctively that she was witnessing something that few people in history had been privileged to see up close. The moment of crowning approached with building anticipation that seemed to make the very air in the Abbey vibrate with energy. As the Archbishop lifted St. Edward's crown above King Charles's head, a profound silence fell over the entire congregation. Even young Prince Louis seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and sat perfectly still, his wide eyes fixed on his grandfather at the front of the church. The weight of the solid gold crown, heavy with centuries of history and responsibility, settled onto Charles's head as he officially became King of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms. William felt tears prick at his eyes as he watched his father complete the transformation that had been decades in the making. The man who had been Prince of Wales for longer than anyone in British history had finally become king, and with that change came a fundamental shift in William's own role and responsibilities. He was no longer simply the Duke of Cambridge or even the heir to the throne in some distant abstract sense. He was now the heir to a reigning monarch, and his own preparation for kingship had taken on new urgency and reality. The congregation erupted in a thunderous cry of "God Save the King" that seemed to shake the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey. The sound rolled through the building like a wave, carrying with it the hopes and prayers of millions of people around the world who were watching this historic moment unfold. Catherine reached discreetly for William's hand, offering him the silent support and strength that had become her trademark throughout their years of public service together. The newly crowned King Charles turned to face his family and subjects with a radiance that seemed to transform his entire bearing. The crown sat naturally upon his head as if it had always belonged there, and his smile encompassed not just joy but relief, gratitude, and determination to serve his people well. His eyes met William's across the space between them, and father and son shared a moment of understanding that spoke to the continuity of the monarchy and the eternal nature of the institution they both served. The children sat transfixed by the pageantry and emotion surrounding them. Even young Louis seemed to grasp that something monumentally important had just occurred, though he might not fully understand its implications for many years to come. Princess Charlotte's eyes shone with what might have been tears of joy, while Prince George maintained his serious composure, even as his grandfather's transformation from prince to king played out before his watchful eyes. As the ceremony continued with additional prayers and blessings, the Wales family remained perfectly positioned and impeccably behaved, representing the future of the monarchy with grace and dignity that would be remembered and analyzed for years to come. The ancient ritual continued to unfold around them, but the central moment had passed, and Britain had a new king. The grand procession from Westminster Abbey to Buckingham Palace began as the newly crowned King Charles stepped into the gold state coach, his ceremonial robes flowing behind him like liquid silk. The ancient carriage, built in 1762, creaked, slightly under the weight of history as it began its slow journey through the streets of London. Prince William and Catherine followed in their own ornate carriage with the children, becoming part of a spectacle that would be remembered for generations to come. The horses stepped high and proud, their hooves creating a rhythmic beat against the cobblestones that seemed to match the heartbeat of the excited crowds, lining every inch of the route. The streets of London had transformed into something magical during the ceremony. What had been impressive crowds in the morning had now swelled to nearly impossible numbers, with people packed shoulder to shoulder along every barrier. Union Jack flags waved like a sea of red, white, and blue, while confetti and flower petals rained down from the windows of office buildings and apartments. The sound was overwhelming, a wall of cheers and applause that seemed to echo off every building and bounce back even louder than before. Catherine waved to the crowds with the natural grace that had made her beloved by the British people, but her attention was divided between acknowledging the well-wishers and keeping a watchful eye on the children. Princess Charlotte had caught sight of a group of young girls wearing tiaras and princess dresses in her honor, and her face lit up with genuine delight as she waved specifically to them. The little girls screamed with excitement when they realized the real princess had noticed them, jumping up and down with joy while their parents tried to capture the moment on their phones. Prince George sat up straight in the carriage, his serious expression softening occasionally when something in the crowd particularly caught his attention. A group of boys from his age had created a large banner reading, "Future King George," and were chanting his name as the carriage passed. For a moment, the weight of his future seemed to settle on his young shoulders, but then he smiled and gave them a small wave that sent the boys into wild celebration. William watched his eldest son navigate these moments with growing pride and amazement at how naturally George seemed to understand his role. Young Prince Louis provided the entertainment that the crowds had been hoping for throughout the long ceremony. Released from the confines of sitting still in Westminster Abbey, he was now free to react naturally to the spectacle around him. He pointed excitedly at the horses pulling their carriage, made faces at children in the crowd, and at one point, attempted to catch the flower petals that were falling like colorful snow around them. His spontaneous reactions delighted the spectators, who cheered even louder whenever he did something particularly charming or amusing. The carriage ride gave William time to process the enormity of what had just occurred inside the abbey. His father was now king, which meant that William's own position had fundamentally changed in ways both subtle and profound. The abstract concept of someday inheriting the throne had suddenly become much more real and immediate. He could see it in the way people looked at him now, with a mixture of respect, expectation, and curiosity about what kind of king he would eventually become. Catherine noticed the shift in public attention as well. The crowd seemed to be studying her with new intensity, as if trying to glimpse the future in her composed features and elegant bearing. She had always been popular with the British people, but now there was an added weight to their interest. She was no longer just the Duchess of Cambridge or even the Princess of Wales. She was the woman who would someday be queen, and that reality seemed to hang in the air around her, like an invisible crown. The military escort surrounding the royal carriages created an impressive display of British pageantry and tradition. Household cavalry officers in their gleaming breastplates and plumed helmets rode alongside the procession, their swords catching the afternoon sunlight. The precision of their formation and the proud bearing of both horses and riders added to the sense of ceremony and importance that surrounded the entire event. Spectators pointed and photographed the mounted guards almost as much as they did the royal family themselves. Street vendors moved through the crowds, selling commemorative items, their voices adding to the carnival atmosphere that had transformed central London. Children wore paper crowns and waved small flags, while adults hoisted them onto their shoulders for better views. The diversity of the crowd reflected modern Britain, with people from every background and community coming together to witness this historic moment. Many had traveled from other countries specifically to be present for the coronation, adding an international flavor to the distinctly British celebration. The route took them past landmarks that held special significance for the royal family. As they passed St. James's Palace, William pointed it out quietly to Catherine, remembering their own wedding day when they had used these same streets for their procession to Westminster Abbey. The memories of that joyful day seemed to blend with the current moment, creating a sense of continuity and purpose that strengthened their resolve to serve their country with dignity and dedication. Television crews positioned at strategic points along the route captured every moment of the procession for the millions of viewers watching around the world. The commentary focused not just on the pageantry and tradition, but on the human moments that made the royal family relatable despite their extraordinary circumstances. When Prince Louis waved enthusiastically at a dog in the crowd, the moment was instantly transmitted to living rooms across the globe, reminding everyone that beneath the crowns and titles were real people sharing in a remarkable experience. The crowds grew even thicker as they approached Buckingham Palace, with people climbing lampposts and hanging from building facades to catch a glimpse of the royal procession. The Victoria Memorial was completely surrounded by spectators, many of whom had been waiting there since before dawn to secure prime positions for the balcony appearance that would conclude the day's public celebrations. The energy was building toward the climactic moment when the newly crowned king would appear before his subjects as their sovereign for the first time. Police barriers strained under the pressure of the enthusiastic crowds, but the atmosphere remained joyful and celebratory, rather than chaotic or dangerous. Volunteers moved through the masses distributing water and helping elderly spectators find places to rest, while St. John ambulance crews stood ready to assist anyone overcome by the excitement or the warm afternoon sun. The organization required to manage such enormous crowds safely was a testament to years of careful planning and preparation. As Buckingham Palace came into view, its familiar facade decorated with royal standards and ceremonial bunting, the family prepared for the final public appearance of this historic day. The balcony overlooking the Mall awaited them, where they would present themselves to the nation as the monarchy moved forward into its next chapter with King Charles III at its head and the Wales family ready to support him in the years ahead. The golden gates of Buckingham Palace swung open as the royal carriages rolled into the forecourt, bringing to a close the public procession that had captivated millions of viewers around the world. Prince William helped Catherine down from their carriage while keeping a watchful eye on the children, who were showing signs of the exhaustion that comes from hours of maintaining perfect public behavior. The palace courtyard provided a brief moment of relative privacy before the final and perhaps most anticipated public appearance of the day would take place on the famous balcony overlooking the Mall. King Charles emerged from the gold state coach with the bearing of a man who had finally stepped into his destiny after 7 decades of preparation. The crown still sat regally upon his head, catching the late afternoon sunlight that streamed through the palace windows. His ceremonial robes rustled softly as palace staff helped arrange them for the upcoming balcony appearance. The transformation from Prince of Wales to reigning monarch seemed complete, and those closest to him could see the mixture of relief, joy, and determination that radiated from his entire being. Inside the palace, the family gathered in the private apartments that had been designated as their staging area for the balcony appearance. Princess Charlotte looked slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur of the staterooms, her eyes wide as she took in the priceless artworks and gilded furniture that surrounded them. Palace staff moved efficiently around them, making final adjustments to clothing and ensuring that everyone looked absolutely perfect for what would likely be the most photographed moment of the entire day. Catherine knelt down to speak quietly with young Prince Louis, whose energy was beginning to flag after the long day of formal ceremonies and public appearances. She smoothed his hair and straightened his jacket while whispering gentle encouragement about how proud she was of his good behavior throughout the coronation. Louis leaned against his mother, drawing comfort from her familiar presence amid all the pomp and circumstance that had surrounded them since early morning. Prince George stood apart from his siblings, his serious expression reflecting the weight of understanding that seemed to be settling upon him with each passing hour. William approached his eldest son and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, recognizing the signs of a young boy grappling with the reality of his future responsibilities. They spoke quietly together, father to son, about the importance of the moment they were about to share with the nation and the world. The sound of the crowds outside grew louder as news spread that the royal family was inside the palace preparing for their balcony appearance. The mall had filled to capacity with people who had waited hours for this moment, many having secured their spots before dawn, despite not knowing exactly when the balcony appearance would occur. The sea of faces stretched as far as the eye could see, with Union Jack flags creating waves of color that rippled through the crowd like a living tapestry. Palace officials conducted final briefings with the family members, reviewing the timing and positioning for the balcony appearance. Every detail had been carefully planned, from where each person would stand to how long they would remain visible to the crowds below. The children received simplified instructions appropriate for their ages, with special attention paid to helping Prince Louis understand what was expected of him during these final moments of public ceremony. The famous Red Room served as their final gathering place before stepping onto the balcony. The walls, covered in crimson silk, had witnessed countless historic moments as royal family members prepared for important public appearances over the centuries. Catherine used the ornate mirrors to make final adjustments to her appearance, while William checked his ceremonial uniform one last time. The children stood together, looking remarkably grown up despite their young ages. As the moment approached for their balcony appearance, the family could hear the roar of the crowd outside growing even louder. Thousands of voices merged into a wall of sound that seemed to make the very walls of the palace vibrate with anticipation. The energy was infectious, and even the most reserved members of the royal party found themselves caught up in the excitement of this historic culmination to an extraordinary day. The tall French doors leading to the balcony were opened by palace footmen in their distinctive uniforms, and suddenly the family could see the incredible sight that awaited them. The mall stretched out like a river of humanity, with people packed together as far as the eye could see. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the entire scene, making the thousands of waving flags look like scattered jewels against the backdrop of London's historic architecture. King Charles stepped onto the balcony first, and the roar from the crowd was deafening. The sound seemed to echo off every building in central London, creating a wave of acclaim that washed over the newly crowned monarch like a blessing from his people. He raised his hand in acknowledgement, and the cheering grew even louder, if such a thing were possible. This was the moment he had waited for his entire life, and the overwhelming reception from his subjects seemed to validate every year of preparation and service. William and Catherine emerged next with their children, and the crowd's enthusiasm reached new heights as they caught sight of the future of the monarchy. Princess Charlotte waved enthusiastically to the crowds below, her natural charm and confidence shining even brighter in this moment of supreme public attention. Prince George maintained his composure while still managing to acknowledge the cheering masses with appropriate royal dignity. Young Prince Louis, initially overwhelmed by the noise and spectacle, soon began waving with the uninhibited joy that only a 4-year-old could display. The Royal Air Force fly-past began right on schedule, with military aircraft streaming overhead in perfect formation. The crowd's cheers reached a crescendo as the planes painted trails across the London sky, their engines adding a thunderous soundtrack to the visual spectacle. Princess Charlotte pointed excitedly at the aircraft while Prince Louis covered his ears against the noise but kept his eyes fixed on the amazing sight above them. As the family stood together on the balcony, waving to their subjects and witnessing the incredible outpouring of affection and support from the British people, the significance of the day seemed to crystallize into this perfect moment. King Charles stood at the center of his family, finally wearing the crown he had waited decades to inherit, while William and Catherine flanked him with their children, representing the continuity and future of the institution they all served. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mall as the balcony appearance continued, but the energy from the crowd never wavered. This was history in the making, a moment that would be remembered and discussed for generations to come. The Wales family had navigated every challenge of this extraordinary day with grace, dignity, and the kind of authentic warmth that had made them beloved by people around the world. As they waved farewell to the cheering masses below, they had successfully helped usher in a new era for the British monarchy, while demonstrating that tradition and modernity could blend together in perfect harmony.